Really, the idea of tonight is just to give you a bit of a heads up on what's coming forward. And it's not a lot of time between now and the start, but there's a little bit of time to set yourself going. And I think it's not bad to start with a fairly loose approach to this. So don't get too caught up in the idea that you have to be suddenly turned into an academic researcher. Really what this is about is just sort of moving into it and using this time to sort of explore a few things that might be useful in a pretty open way. So ultimately, we'll end up with some level of proposition, which would then move towards your research project, whether it's immediately or later on. But at this stage, what we're doing is just setting the groundwork and getting things in place so that once you come to that, you've got enough work done to feel pretty confident that you can use the time in the research project to get into that activity. So the first assessment, and I'll just sort of work through this fairly in a pretty linear way. The first assessment is to, first of all, map your practice, whatever that happens to be, and use this time to think through all of the stuff that you've done. And it's not just things that you might think of as design, yeah? So what are the things that have brought you to this point? What are the things that have brought you to MDF? And what are you aiming to get out of it? And of course, because that's human-centered design, we bring in things that are outside of what we would normally think of even as career points. Yeah, so there might be pivots in your own life that you want to talk about. There might be some points where you've confronted a challenge and you think, well, this is a good way of dealing with it. Might be career points, and it also might be that you're actually in that process of making a shift at the moment. Yeah, so all of that will start to become obvious. I'll just share with you now everyone's seeing this work. So this is from a student a couple of years ago who was doing the first assessment piece, which I've put up on the package, and that is a mapping of her career. But what's nice here, I think, is you get both the chronological sense of what's going on, but also these really nice little sort of storytelling devices that she's brought into it, visual and text. Yep, so this doesn't have to be something that's highly academic. So, for example, this idea of leading a design project, I think, is nice, and within that, there's a sense of the charting of it. Get out a bit. Hard to see those, well, you can't see those comments, but I think you get a bit of an idea of an overlay. So not only is it about what happened, but it's about the experience of that particular event. So as you can see, while you might be able to diagram out your own career, really what we're looking at here is a bit of a story that's starting to emerge. Let me just get back to where we are. So everyone can see that map? Cool. So that's part of the first assessment. And that's something, well, I guess the first point to make is that assessment 1 comes in about 2 weeks after you start. And this is a chance to do that. So it's only a 10%er, and it's really about just sort of laying it out on the ground, so putting it on the table. So what we have, and let me just share again. It should be the Medium post that you're seeing now. What we have is just the map, like that map of 5 years of your design practice. You can go back further if you want to, or use it less. Fewer years, that's fine. Important here is the idea that where you see design playing out, but also what your other practice is. So obviously not all of you are designers, so you won't go back into too far. This idea of your project proposal, again, this is not something that's going to lock you in to anything. It's about just sort of getting a little bit of a feel for the field that you're working in. What are the things that interest you and where you might take that interest. So just literally map that out and note it down at this point. And if you've got questions about it, or sort of you're uncertain where that might lead to, bring that into your poster. Yeah, so don't feel like this is going to be assessed on being highly accurate. It's about getting those wheels turning. Research questions are that classic thing about what if, or what would it be to bring design into a particular area? What would be the impact of human-centered design on your conventional practice, for example? Where are the trends that you might be able to discern? So I wouldn't worry too much about the research question at the moment. It's very much a part of what you'll be learning in the first part of the course. But it's just to try and find something to anchor your work around. Yeah. And with all of this stuff, as I think I said in the package, start with what motivates you. Why did you get into MDF? What was that driver that got you into it? Where initially did you think it was going to take you? And that for a lot of people, that might have been a sort of just adding extra skills. For other people, it's about a transition from one sector to another. For other people, it's about opening up some ideas that you've been thinking about, but you haven't really had the opportunity to work through. For others, it's about sort of upskilling or repositioning yourself in your own workplace. So note those things down and just sort of keep them there as a reference point. I think what we'll find, or what we've found in the past, is that people actually go back to initial projects within the program to see what their concepts or their ideas were. So if you were doing context, for example, there'd be an opportunity to go back to that work. Service design or any of the other courses will have some sort of sense of what your motivation was. So review some of your previous MDF work just to see if you can pull that out. And then we're looking at the breaking that down into keywords. And this is where you start to build that literature review. So the keywords are, it's a bit of an art. Things like design is not a really good keyword because it's so broad. Even human-centered design is a little bit too large. It's going to bring back a lot of material if you put that into a Google search. But something like service design for aged care might start to narrow it down. So think about what it is that might actually get you to the place, to the literature that you eventually using. And then the practice review side of that is to look at other practices. Yeah, other people whose practice you're attracted to for whatever reason. And that might be someone you've read about, and obviously international and local, or it might be someone you know of. It might be something you've heard at one of the conferences, for example. Somebody's presented something and you think, well, that's interesting. They're talking about similar things to what I'm interested in, but they're using their own practice, their own design studio or their practice within another place in order to explore that thing. So again, be quite open with all of that. Let it float out rather than try and constrain it at this point. And see if you can find several different threads, both in your literature and your practice keywords. Yeah. So don't constrain it to those classic terms like service design. Look for the nuance part of it. And then within that A1, it also includes a couple of diagrammatic representations of your scenarios. And that's just simply saying, okay, for this period of time, I'm going to look at the literature. This period of time, I'm going to look at the practice. This period of time, I'm going to look at what I might be able to generate in the research project. So that might be an engagement or a workshop or some sort of public activity. Yeah. And these are speculative, obviously, at the moment. So it's just mapping that out and just getting it down on paper. It then might be that you review that and think, okay, I'm going to change these things around, just see what it would be to start with the activity and then look into the literature and look into the practices, that type of thing. Yeah. So this is a proposition now moving into the project, but it's just that starting point that might get you there. That's really all you need to do over this next few weeks. Just keep that sort of thinking bubbling along, sketch it out. Keep in mind that this is a design practice. It's not an academic proposition at this stage. So sketch it out, draw it, build it, whatever it happens to be that works for you. Look at the ways that you might bring your visual practice into it, your design practice, your modeling, mapping, whatever it happens to be. And as I was saying at the start, keep it really loose. So it's not something that you're trying to find a finished product from. You're really just letting it tell you what might be coming through. So doing a number of iterations of that first assessment is really useful because it just gives that sort of opportunity for things to come to the surface, which might be harder to find if you're looking for an outcome. Any questions on A1? Nope. Cool. A2 is getting into a little bit more of the research side of things, and I guess again our experience is that a lot of people find this as the biggest learning curve particularly within this course, but also, I guess, within the whole program. So this is actually asking you to do something in a very particular way, whereas in all the other courses, there's a lot of room for interpretation and expression. This one is actually saying, well, this is a thing. So you need to be able to understand what is being required here. And you also want to be able to build enough material underneath you in order to be able to substantiate your claim. One claim in your proposition will be that there's potentially a gap that you're wanting to fill. Another one is that there is a trend towards a particular way of thinking, and you want to get into that trend and start to follow it. So all of these things have some level of precedent. There will be other people thinking about them, writing about them, working through them, reporting back on their own research projects, etc. This is a big fishing expedition. So really what you want to try and do is get it down into something that you can manage within the time, and it's not a lot of time, but at the same time feel like you're scanning the horizon. Yeah, so that there's a number of things that you're looking at, not just one sector or one sliver of this thing. So the idea of the literature review is to substantiate those positions. It's also to open up new ideas that you may not have come across. And it's to start to build this sense of yourself as somebody who is a peer within this research structure. Yeah, so that you're looking at putting up a position, not an opinion, but a stance, if you like. Yeah, so it's not about writing your own opinion and then saying somebody else agrees with it. It's taking a stance and saying, well, these are the writers that I know have supported that stance or are looking at that, and these are the people who contradict it in some way. So you're placing yourself within that space, and you're trying to get to the point where you're feeling comfortable about that, so that you've got a good sense of what's going on. It's a survey, it's a sort of a picture of the landscape. So obviously to do that, you scan the literature and identify the things that you think are going to be relevant to you. And then you note those down, and very good opportunity, I think, at this point to start to work with the technology that archives those ideas. So Evernote, for example, is quite good. There's a range of other platforms where you can collect the literature, the website, the book reference, whatever it happens to be, and then annotate your own thinking around that, and then start to cluster together particular ideas, some ideas that are for your stance, some ideas that are contrary to your stance, and then think about what is the argument, what is the case that you're putting forward. This again is not something you need to be coming back to on the week one with a fully developed piece. It's really just to start that process of scanning, reading, notating, and building the foundations for it, yeah, so that you've got a system that might work for you across the methods course, but particularly into the research project. You've got the package that outlines the various questions that you might sort of pose to the literature. And then ways of, bringing a little bit of a filter to it, so that you're not just throwing things down, but you've got a feeling of a building a case, building an argument. Really important, and this again is one of the things that people often struggle with. It's important to scan broadly. Yeah. So this idea of the primary, secondary, and tertiary sources is really useful. Primary is the first-hand things, the things that you can access, that somebody's gone through and done something and reported back on it. Secondary is where somebody else will start to look at these things and then analyze and synthesize them. And tertiary is that idea of, you know, the signals or the signposts that might actually point to them. Yep. So they're pretty straightforward. Your primary sources might also include your own investigations, but at this stage that wouldn't be really all that appropriate at the moment. So thoughts and comments on lit review? Again, this is, it's not to come back with something finished. It's about just sort of coming in with a few of the structures in place so that you can actually jump in and get it going. There'll be a lot of discussion in the first few weeks about what that literature review is and how to make it specific for you and your project. So while there's a sort of generic structure to these things, each of you will have a very different topic and you'll be looking at very different literature. So a lot of that conversation will be, yeah, particular to your own situation. But the more you can start with this idea of what your initial interest is and get that down, the more likely it is that you'll be able to craft a literature review that's really valuable to you. So in terms of the two courses, your methods and then the final research project, a couple of things are important to note. One is that in A3 in methods, you'll be asked to put together a final proposition. That will be clearly starting to filter down and to focus on what you're doing. However, it is not locked in. Yeah, so don't feel like you have to come up with the complete answer in methods, because that will be something that will still evolve. In terms of the assessment, your final assessment, piece A3 in methods is that proposition. Your first assessment in research project is restating that proposition. Yeah. So if there's been change in your thinking because you've found some interesting literature that takes you in a different direction, or you've done something that you think is relevant now that sort of moves you into a different place, or an opportunity has come up, of course you change your research question, you change your proposition. That will then lead to some level of change within your literature review. Yep. So at this stage, it's pretty broad, and it'll be scan, a survey of what's going on. Once you get into the project, the research project, you'll really fine tune that and bring it down into something. So you might actually be doing, referring to a lot of literature now that is in fact maybe redundant or not necessary. It's part of your grounding thinking, but it doesn't drive the thing that you're doing immediately. So sometimes it's about throwing out some of the lit, and other times it's about bringing in a new strand. Yep. But again, don't feel like that has to be resolved immediately. So A3, I don't think we need to go through this evening because that's getting a bit too far down the track. But I'm happy to take any questions on any of this stuff. and any ideas that you might be having about how to set yourself up for methods in particular. Yep.
Marius, I would like to ask you that currently I'm facing a problem with either going too broad on what I want to do,
yep,
and going too narrow on or focusing too much on what I want to do. So how do you balance that out?
That's a process, and it's a process that's probably best done by setting something down on paper, and in the first instance, looking at it yourself. And as you've said, you know, you've identified that it's too broad, but maybe also too narrow. So use your design skills to, you know, the double diamond, if you like. There's a discovery phase, and then you're starting to define it. So what would that look like if you start to narrow it down from this broader piece? What are the things that you would personally remove in order to get a little bit more focus? And potentially what are the things that you might open up in the next stage that you're not quite there with? Yeah. So it's a very iterative process. And this is why starting now is quite useful, because you can actually spend that time sketching it out, you know, putting them up and just having a look at how things look to you. Scoping a research project is very fine art, because you've got time constraints. You might also have personnel constraints. So if your project, for example, relies very much on interviewing a number of people, you have to be able to rely on them being ready to be interviewed, but also to be available. Yep. So you've got to do this sort of little bit of a play where you have enough people that you think, I could get 3 people and I could have a great conversation with each of them, but if 2 of them drop out, what's my plan B? Yeah. So a lot of this is about sketching out what you think will happen, and then also thinking what's likely not to happen that is putting you at a bit of risk. And if that's the case, what's your plan B? How would you work around that to make sure that you're not setting yourself up for a really precarious research project? And we spend quite a bit of time on working with you on that, because often people build very large ideas and projects, and with a lot of people involved, sometimes it's possible to pull that off. But sometimes all that does is just give you more of the same. So what you're looking for here is a quality piece. So you're looking at getting right to the heart of it, rather than just having 25 people all saying the same thing. Yeah. So there'll be a lot of conversation around that. Does anyone have any thoughts around the practice-based research model? I think if you've done something like clients, for example, you will have some level of experience with how you set it up, how you set up a project or an engagement or a workshop or a public event, whatever it happens to be, and then how you come back and review that and reflect on it. If you haven't done that yet, and that's fine, then what we would do is just work you through that process. So I guess on that point, a couple of things come to my mind. One is building a constant reflection on what you're doing, even in this first stage. What is the literature that I'm looking at and why? What are the things that I'm finding? And what are the surprises that are coming up? And these things are often best done by mapping them out, literally drawing out, you know, the networks of authors, the threads that you think are coming off it, the ideas, the insights that you're getting from it. The other really important thing, and this is again one of the foundation things to set going now, is that system of documentation. Yeah. So writing down all of those ideas and those insights and those sort of thoughts and questions that you have, but most importantly, having them there as something that you can access back to. Yeah, because this will get fairly fast-paced, and there'll be a lot of things going on. There'll be a lot of thoughts coming up in your mind. If you don't have an ability to go back and say, okay, well, what was I thinking 2 weeks ago? Where are those notes? Then you're going to find that you're duplicating a lot of the work. So this is about getting pretty smart at keeping that. Again, you know, I think there's, I think technologies are a great way of doing that. The Evernote is really useful, or something similar. But if you happen to be a visual person, just a sketchbook is fine. Just sort of build the structure around it, give it a sequence, give it a calendar date, for example, so you can refer back to it. Use the idea of keywords. So whenever you come across a keyword that you think is working, just sort of keep using that as a tag, like a hashtag, what you might do on Twitter, so that you can then scan back and think, okay, where's that hashtag self-care in design, for example. So a bit of a taxonomy is useful. You can let that be quite organic at this stage, but having something there that sort of helps you to refer back to ideas, and then bring those ideas forward and look at them in association with others, is really useful.
Marius, I have a question about keywords.
Yep.
So if it's a combination of, let's say, 3-4 words, okay, for example, it's driving the sustainable behaviors of customers within retail, for example. So that's a bunch of keywords, right? So do I look at it as a whole, or do I break it down as different words and see how it goes?
It's a really good question. What I would do is look at them individually. So if you put sustainable into Google, for example, just to look for some references, you'll find a universe full of references that will not be able to be scanned through. But if sustainable plus one other word, and you have to think what that other word might be, we'll start to narrow that down. And you can do simple things like the quotes around a phrase in order to narrow it down. Have a look, though, as well at when you come across some literature, particularly academic literature, have a look at the keywords that they use, so you can start to see what they're talking about, or who they're trying to appeal to through a fairly common use of keywords. And often those will be on the abstract. So if you're looking at an academic journal, and I'd encourage you to spend quite a bit of time now with academic journals, not just websites and books, more popular media books, but the journals. Just have a look at how they structure the way that they present information. That'll give you a good idea of why academic writing works in a particular way. The key sort of functions are, first of all, to put out a simplified version of what you're talking about, and that's the abstract. It's like an executive summary, if you like, just allows people to say, that's a topic, that's a point of view that I want to look at, that's an author whose work is well regarded. Yeah. Author names and their own sort of background, the titles or their affiliations, where they're coming from, is useful. Keywords is really useful because that sort of ties them in. It's exactly the same as hashtags. It just sort of aggregates things together. So you can say, okay, well, look, sustainability plus, what was the other section of your phrase?
Customer behavior and within the retail industry.
Yeah, so sustainability in retail, for example, will still give you a huge amount of material, but there will be something in there that starts to work with it. And it might be sustainability and critical retail practices, for example. Yeah. So that you're just trying to filter as much as you can without losing the value. Yeah. The other thing that academic journals do is there is a sort of a convention of high-ranking journals, and we'll publish a few of those or put those up. But it's useful to go for what are the ones where most people go for a particular thing. Yeah. So for looking at, there's a journal called Design Management Institute, I think, DMI. And that's a really good starting point because it's very pragmatic. It's about design, contemporary innovation, where design's being used both in design sector, but also maybe in business or development or wherever, politics, whatever it happens to be. So you're finding that first point of entry, and then you're looking to see where that might go out from. Yeah, so it's a job, but it's a useful way of going about getting smart at the type of literature that you're accessing.
Marius, are there any of the former students who have published from either the Lit Review or the project?
Not so much published, but there are people who've done talks, etc., based on their work, and yep. I will ask them. I need to get permission to share some of the stuff. When I share it, the proviso is that you take it as an example, not as a model, because it's really important to understand that this is based around your own individual motivation and interests. So that won't necessarily fit into somebody else's writing. Yeah. So that's the type of things that we have to be a bit careful about. There's some great work people have done, but it's something that's driven them, and it may not be the right format for you.
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Cool. So look, I think we can end up there. Just go back to where I started. Use this as an opportunity to be a bit sort of free flowing. Yeah, we'll crank that down into something much more serious and rigorous. But at the moment, what you're doing is trying to sort of pull together some of the things that you might be thinking, have in the back of your mind, that you want to get out on paper, and you want to just sort of see whether they look sensible or interesting. Would they be enough for you to drive a project, for example, or is it an idea that you could probably deal with in a different way? Is anybody thinking of a final proposition at this point? Notionally, of course. Some maybe. Kinda is good. Cool. All right. Well, if there's no other pressing issues, I will bid you a very merry festive season, and hope you all come back ready, willing, able.
What is our weekly slot for this course?
Wednesday evening, 6 or 6:30, I'm not sure. And yeah, so it's interesting. There's about 20 people signed up for it, so it's going to be a biggie. And we've got 2 people on hand to manage this level of energy. I was going to say anxiety. I meant energy. And you'll find them both very practiced in this area.
Oh, okay.
Cool. All right. See you on the other side.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
See ya.